Well, good evening, church. I wanted to talk about giving to a gospel ministry in the local church and how that works and what that's like. Um, I think every Christian wants the money that we work hard to earn, that the Lord puts in our lap and in our possession. If we give it to a local church, whether it's 10% or more in many cases, that we want that to go toward gospel ministry. I think that's the desire of every true believer. And, I heard something today that was interesting. I wanted to pass it along because it got me thinking. I was out, typically on Mondays I'll go out and I'll pray and kind of pray about numerous things, but the week ahead. And I was out praying in these trails and I come across this husband and wife. And we start talking. I was trying to figure out if they're believers and found out they go to a church, local church here. And they're saying one of the reasons they're at this church is because this church gives a large majority of their funds to gospel ministry. I think it was 80-90% or something. And so they were saying this is why we're at this church, because we've been at other churches in the past and they don't have a priority to give to gospel ministry. They're just given toward buildings and staff salaries and things like that. And they're not prioritizing gospel ministry. And so anyway, this guy's explaining this to me, and anyway, after that conversation, I was kind of thinking about that, and I was thinking back how I used to think about these matters. I would think very similar to how that man thought. There's essentially two categories. If you give your money to the local church, it's going to basically be spent in two categories. One category would be all of the needs, staff salaries, building supplies and utilities for the building and air conditioning and the facilities themselves. And then you have this other category of missions and local ministries and all the things locally that, food pantries and counseling ministries and all these things that the people are preaching the gospel. So that's gospel ministry, and that's just kind of other stuff that you don't really want to give to, but you do it. And that's how I used to think. And I remember when we first started the church, I thought, man, I would love to one day kind of 50% of our budget could go toward gospel ministry and 50% could kind of care for staff salaries and building and stuff like that. That would be a great place to get to. And what was interesting today is after I heard that man say that, I was reflecting on how my thinking has changed over the years. As I've studied the New Testament and understood things better, I just don't believe that paradigm should exist at all. I think if a church is a gospel preaching church, if the vision of the church is to exalt Christ through preaching right doctrinal truth about Christ in the power of the Holy Spirit, if the Great Commission's being fulfilled, if the local church is being brought to health, meaning Ephesians 4, they're maturing into the full stature and measure of Christ. If that type of gospel ministry is happening inside the church and advancing outside the church into the culture, then everything you give to that local church should be in line with gospel ministry. Everything. So that 100% of the budget should be justified to be gospel ministry giving. Because I know I give my money to the church as well, and I want that money to go toward the advancement of the gospel. And I know that's probably the case with everyone in the local church who's a believer. They want their money to go toward the advancement of the gospel. So how my thinking has changed is if you have a qualified pastor, right? Paul says support them who labor in preaching and teaching. The labor is worthy of his wages, Paul says, right? So you should support a pastor who's laboring in gospel ministry, who's qualified to pastor. A missionary, 1 John 3:8 says that we ought to support people like these, that is, qualified missionaries that are sent out, that we may be fellow workers for the truth. So the giver becomes a fellow worker for the truth as they support a gospel advancer, a gospel missionary that's either working, preaching the gospel inside the churches or taking it outside the churches into the culture, that we become fellow workers for the truth as we support financially these laborers. And so there isn't a distinction, it doesn't seem in the scriptures, to say those, supporting a pastor or having a staff salary or a missionary salary is somehow, that the missionary salary is more noble or something. They should both be preaching the gospel. They should both be advancing the mission of the church, so that when you give to a local church, whether they're supporting a pastor or whether they're supporting a missionary, it's all gospel advancement. It all should be gospel advancement, or we shouldn't hire that pastor, or we shouldn't send out that missionary unless they're advancing the gospel. We shouldn't buy crayons for the kids' class if it can't be justified that it's not advancing the gospel. I shouldn't buy ink for my printer with the church's money if it's not for writing sermons or Priscilla printing out lyrics to music that isn't helping to advance the gospel or build up the local church. Everything we do should be toward that end. Everything we do should be toward that Christ-exalting end. And if it's not, we shouldn't do it, number one. And number two, nobody should give toward it. So I want the consciences of everyone who gives to the Cross Church to be freed to know everything I give is going toward the advancement of the gospel. Everything we do is tied to that aim, to that end, to that vision. I think that's very important. So that when I want a clear conscience, that when I say, "Hey guys, we need you to give more to get this building, so we have a place to worship, so that we have a place to make disciples and send out missionaries and do counseling and preach the gospel week in, week out for years and years to come, so that our kids can hear the gospel and we can do focused ministry to them." When we have all of these gospel aims and ambitions, and we need a building to do that in, so give for the building. I want you to know that that's not just some sort of other issue that's disconnected from the gospel. I want you to have confidence that that is connected with the vision to advance the gospel. So all of our giving to the local church should be to advance the gospel. That's why, in all honesty, if you give to a church that isn't preaching the gospel, I think that's sin. I don't think you should be giving to a church that isn't advancing the gospel. So only a church that is preaching the true gospel you should ever give to. And if you give to a church preaching the true gospel, then hopefully everything you give is for the purpose of gospel ministry. All right, so just something I was thinking about today. I'll say to our church, for those of you who are listening from our church, which is most everybody who watches this, I'm sure, we still need more money for the giving campaign. That is partly why I'm doing this, to renew our minds and help us remember that giving toward a building isn't some extra thing, and missionary support is something else. All of this is for the sake of advancing the gospel. All of this is for the upbuilding and beautification of Christ's church, or we shouldn't be doing it. So we need more money for the building. I trust you'll be praying and trying to discern how much to give on that. Me and Priscilla are praying about right now what a generous gift looks like. We're about to give a what we would consider probably the most generous gift we've ever given, and we're praying through that right now ourselves. So may the Lord guide us, but may it all be for the advancement of his gospel and the upbuilding of his church. Love you guys. Y'all have a blessed evening.